The gentle hum of jet engines filled the cabin as Flight 2317 prepared for its journey from Atlanta to San Francisco. Among the passengers settling into their seats was Staff Sergeant Michelle Thompson, a decorated Army medic returning home after completing her third tour of duty. Her pristine military uniform bore the weight of her achievements, medals that spoke of lives saved and sacrifices made in service of her country. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, her carry-on bag secured firmly over her shoulder, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about reuniting with her family after 15 long months. The familiar scent of airplane cabin air mixed with the subtle fragrance of coffee being prepared by the flight attendants brought a sense of finally heading home. Finding her assigned seat in row 23, Michelle noticed an elderly woman already occupying the window seat, engrossed in her tablet. The woman barely glanced up as Michelle stored her bag in the overhead compartment. Just as Michelle was about to take her seat, a well-dressed businessman in his 50s approached, checking his boarding pass for confirmation of his middle seat assignment. The next few moments would transform what should have been a routine 6-hour flight into an incident that would test not only Michelle's patience but also her unwavering commitment to her values and training. The businessman, whom other passengers would later describe as Mr. Richards, took one look at Michelle's uniform and dark skin, his face contorting into an expression of visible displeasure. "I paid full price for this ticket," he announced loudly, making sure nearby passengers could hear. "I refuse to sit next to someone who probably got their seat through military privileges." His words carried a weight heavier than mere complaint about seating arrangements, they dripped with prejudice that had nothing to do with military benefits. Several passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A young college student 3 rows ahead removed his headphones, turning to witness the unfolding scene. The elderly woman by the window finally looked up from her tablet, her eyes widening as she processed the situation. Michelle stood perfectly still, her military training evident in her composed stance. Years of handling high-pressure situations in combat zones had prepared her for moments requiring extraordinary restraint. Yet this was different. This wasn't about dodging bullets or treating wounded soldiers. This was about maintaining dignity in the face of blatant discrimination on American soil, the very land she had sworn to protect. Flight attendant Lisa Chen, who had been helping another passenger store luggage, quickly made her way to row 23. She had witnessed similar situations before, but something about the calm dignity in Michelle's bearing made this incident particularly poignant. Before she could intervene, Michelle spoke, her voice steady and clear, carrying the kind of authority that comes not from volume but from inner strength. "Sir," she began, meeting his gaze directly, "I've spent the last 15 months treating wounded soldiers of every race, religion, and background. When someone's bleeding out, their life in my hands, I've never once stopped to ask about their beliefs or the color of their skin. I've served this country so that everyone, including you, can enjoy the freedom to express their opinions, even when those opinions reflect prejudice." The cabin had grown remarkably quiet. Even the distant chatter of other passengers seemed to fade away as Michelle continued, "And yes, I did use my military benefits for this ticket. I earned them by putting my life on the line for our country. But I also earned something far more valuable, the understanding that what unites us is far stronger than what divides us." A slow, steady applause began to build from somewhere in the back of the plane. The businessman's face flushed red, though whether from shame or anger remained unclear. The elderly woman by the window suddenly spoke up, her voice carrying the wisdom of years. "Young man, I'd be honored to trade seats with you. I'd much rather sit next to this brave soldier who represents the very best of our country." The businessman, now faced with the collective disapproval of his fellow passengers and the quiet dignity of the soldier he had attempted to humiliate, mumbled something about finding another seat. As he retreated toward the back of the plane, more passengers joined in the applause, some even standing to show their support. Michelle finally took her seat, her hands slightly trembling, not from fear or anger, but from the surge of emotion that came with standing up for something larger than herself. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Chen, no relation to the flight attendant, reached over and patted Michelle's hand. "My late husband was a Vietnam veteran," she shared softly. "He would have been proud to see how you handled that situation." As the plane began its taxi down the runway, several passengers came by to express their support and gratitude, both for Michelle's service and for her composed response to discrimination. A young girl, no more than 7, shyly approached with her mother and handed Michelle a drawing she had just made, a stick figure in uniform with a cape, clearly meant to be a superhero. As Flight 2317 reached its cruising altitude, the initial tension began to dissolve into something unexpected, a sense of community rarely experienced in the confines of an aircraft. The incident with the businessman had sparked conversations throughout the cabin, transforming strangers into thoughtful participants in an impromptu dialogue about respect, service, and human dignity. Michelle sat quietly, processing the events while looking through the photos on her phone, images of her medical unit in action, faces of colleagues who had become family during their deployment. Mrs. Chen, still seated beside her, noticed a particular photo that caught her attention, a group shot of Michelle's team celebrating after a successful emergency surgery in difficult conditions. "Those smiles tell quite a story," Mrs. Chen observed softly, her eyes twinkling with genuine interest. Michelle found herself sharing the tale behind the photo, a challenging day when her team had worked tirelessly to save a local child caught in crossfire. "In moments like that," Michelle explained, "nothing matters except preserving life. Every heartbeat is precious, regardless of who it belongs to." 2 rows ahead, a middle school teacher on her way to a conference was inspired to share about how she uses similar real-life stories to teach her students about empathy and understanding. "Would you mind if I shared your story with my class?" she asked, turning around in her seat. "They need to hear about people who stand up for what's right without resorting to anger or violence." The flight attendant, Lisa Chen, brought Michelle a cup of hot chocolate. On the house, she insisted with a warm smile. "My brother serves in the Marines. Every time I see someone in uniform, I think of him." This sparked a chain reaction of kindness, with other passengers sharing their own connections to military service and stories of facing prejudice with grace. A young software engineer seated across the aisle spoke up about his experiences as a first-generation American, dealing with stereotypes and misconceptions. "What struck me about your response," he told Michelle, "was how you turned it into a teaching moment instead of an argument. That's real strength." The incident began to take on a life of its own as passengers shared their perspectives on social media. A travel blogger in first class wrote about witnessing the exchange, her post quickly gaining attention. "Just witnessed an extraordinary moment of grace and dignity at 35,000 feet. A female soldier just showed us all what real courage looks like, not just in combat, but in everyday life." As the flight progressed, Michelle learned that Mrs. Chen was actually traveling to San Francisco to meet her first great-grandchild. She pulled out her tablet again, this time to show Michelle photos of her expanding family. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when my husband first returned from Vietnam, he faced similar prejudice. But he always said that the way to fight darkness is not with more darkness, but with light." The young girl who had drawn the superhero picture earlier came by again, this time with questions about being a military medic. Michelle explained her role in terms the child could understand, emphasizing the importance of helping others and staying calm in difficult situations. The girl's mother, recording the interaction on her phone with permission, mouthed a silent "thank you" to Michelle. Even the flight crew became part of the unfolding story. The captain, during his mid-flight announcement, made a special mention of having a decorated service member aboard and thanked all military personnel for their service. The simple acknowledgement brought fresh applause from the passengers, creating another wave of warmth throughout the cabin. The businessman who had caused the initial confrontation remained in his new seat at the back of the plane, notably subdued. Several passengers reported seeing him engaged in what appeared to be deep reflection, occasionally glancing toward Michelle's row with an expression that suggested internal struggle. About halfway through the flight, a senior flight attendant approached Michelle with an unexpected message. "We've been receiving emails from our ground staff," she explained. "Apparently, some passengers have been texting and posting about what happened, and it's already gaining attention. Several veterans groups have reached out to the airline expressing their support." Michelle's response to this news reflected the same humble dignity she had shown earlier. "I just hope this helps someone else facing a similar situation," she said quietly. Sometimes the best response to prejudice is to demonstrate the very humanity that others fail to see. The story continued to ripple through the cabin in various ways. A group of business travelers began discussing their company's diversity and inclusion policies. A retired teacher shared stories about the integration of schools in the 1960s. Each conversation sparked by the incident seemed to uncover new layers of understanding and reflection. Mrs. Chen, who had been quietly observing much of this, finally shared something personal. "You know," she said to Michelle, "my husband used to say that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with patience and understanding. Watching you today, I think he was right." She patted Michelle's hand again, this time with the familiarity of a friend rather than a stranger. As the flight entered its fourth hour, what had begun as an ugly display of prejudice had transformed into something beautiful, a microcosm of human connection and understanding at 35,000 feet. The cabin had become a space where strangers felt safe sharing their own experiences with discrimination and triumph, each story adding to a larger narrative about the power of dignity in the face of prejudice. As Flight 2317 continued its journey westward, the atmosphere in the cabin had evolved into something remarkable. What started as a tense confrontation had blossomed into a powerful demonstration of humanity at its finest. The story was no longer just about Michelle's response to discrimination, it had become a catalyst for deeper connections and understanding among the passengers. During the meal service, something unexpected happened. The businessman who had caused the initial confrontation approached Michelle's row, his demeanor notably different from their first encounter. He stood in the aisle, visibly struggling with his words. The cabin grew quiet again, but this time with a different kind of tension. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been sitting back there, thinking about my behavior, and I'm ashamed." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My father was actually a military man, and he would be disgusted by how I acted today. I let my prejudices overshadow everything that uniform represents." Michelle looked up at him, maintaining the same composed dignity she had shown earlier. The businessman continued, "I've been watching how everyone has rallied around you, sharing stories and showing support. It made me realize how my actions reflect a darkness within myself that I need to address." Mrs. Chen, still seated by the window, spoke up. "Recognition of our mistakes is the first step toward change," she said kindly. "The real test is what we do with that recognition." Her words seemed to resonate not just with the businessman, but with everyone listening. The moment was interrupted by light turbulence, causing the businessman to steady himself against the seats. Michelle gestured to the empty space beside her. Mrs. Chen had earlier moved to the window seat. "Would you like to sit down? We can continue this conversation properly." As he settled into the seat, the businessman introduced himself properly as Robert. He shared how he had grown up in a privileged but isolated environment, and how his prejudices had been shaped by limited exposure to diversity. "That's not an excuse," he quickly added, "but I'm beginning to understand how living in a bubble can distort your worldview." Michelle listened attentively, her training as a medic evident in her ability to hear not just the words, but the pain and regret behind them. She shared stories from her military service, tales of soldiers from all backgrounds coming together, trusting each other with their lives, and forming bonds that transcended any superficial differences. The young girl who had drawn the superhero picture earlier watched this exchange with wide-eyed fascination. She tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "Mommy, is this what you meant by being the bigger person?" The question brought gentle laughter from those around them, breaking the tension. The mother nodded. Yes, sweetheart. This is exactly what it means. The child's innocent observation seemed to perfectly capture the essence of what was unfolding. As the conversation continued, other passengers began sharing their own experiences of prejudice and personal growth. A young professional talked about how her perspectives had changed after working abroad. An elderly gentleman spoke about his journey from holding biased views to becoming an advocate for inclusion in his community. Lisa Chen, the flight attendant who had been following these developments throughout the flight, shared something she had noticed. In all my years of flying, I've never seen a cabin full of strangers connect like this. It's like we're all part of something bigger than ourselves. The travel blogger who had earlier posted about the incident provided an update. Her initial post had gone viral, with thousands of shares and comments from people around the world. Many were sharing their own stories of facing discrimination with dignity, creating a ripple effect of inspiration and hope. Michelle's phone buzzed with a notification. Her sister had seen the viral posts and sent a message of pride and support. "Trust you to turn a difficult situation into a teaching moment," the message read. "Mom and Dad are going to be so proud when they hear about this." Robert, still seated beside Michelle, shared how the incident had made him realize the need to address similar attitudes in his workplace. As a senior executive, he acknowledged his responsibility to promote inclusive practices and challenge discriminatory behavior. "Your response to my horrible behavior has taught me more than 1,000 diversity training sessions," he admitted. The retired teacher who had been listening nearby offered her perspective. "Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most uncomfortable moments. What matters is how we use those lessons to grow and help others grow too." As the flight entered its final hours, passengers began exchanging contact information, determined to stay connected after this unique experience. The middle school teacher had already begun drafting a lesson plan based on the day's events, with Michelle's permission to share the story with her students. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed the entire transformation from her window seat, summed up what many were feeling. "Today, we've all been reminded that change is possible, that dignity can overcome discrimination, and that it's never too late to learn and grow." The young software engineer added his own observation. "What started as one person's act of prejudice has ended up bringing an entire plane full of strangers together. It's like we're living through a real-time lesson in human connection." As the sun began to set outside the aircraft windows, casting a golden glow through the cabin, the atmosphere was one of genuine warmth and community. The flight had become more than just a journey from Atlanta to San Francisco. It had become a powerful demonstration of how courage, dignity, and forgiveness could transform lives. As Flight 2317 began its gradual descent into San Francisco International Airport, the story that had unfolded at 35,000 feet was already taking on a life of its own beyond the aircraft's cabin. The travel blogger's posts had caught the attention of several military support organizations, and messages of solidarity were pouring in from around the country. Michelle sat quietly, scrolling through the numerous notifications on her phone. Her sister had sent another message. Their local veteran support group wanted to feature her story in their monthly newsletter. "You've always been a quiet leader," the message read, "but today you've shown what true leadership looks like." Robert, who had remained in the seat next to Michelle, was having his own moment of revelation. He pulled out his business card and handed it to her. "I run a consulting firm," he explained, his voice carrying a new note of purpose. "We work with various corporations on their organizational culture. Would you consider speaking at some of our events? Your story, our story, could help others understand the impact of unconscious bias." Before Michelle could respond, the young college student who had witnessed the initial confrontation spoke up from the row behind. He had been quietly documenting the entire journey through sketches in his notebook. "I'm an art student," he explained, showing them his drawings. "Would you mind if I turned this into a graphic novel for my final project? I think it could reach young people in a powerful way." The cabin crew, who had been witness to the entire transformation, had their own surprise in store. The lead flight attendant approached with a handful of first-class upgrade vouchers for future flights. "The airline would like to thank you," she explained to Michelle, "not just for your military service, but for showing us all how to handle difficult situations with grace." Mrs. Chen, still observing from her window seat, shared a personal revelation. "My great-grandchild that I'm going to meet," she said, her eyes tearing up slightly, "will be born into a world that still has prejudice. But today has shown me that there's hope for change, one person at a time." The middle school teacher had finished outlining her lesson plan based on the day's events. She showed it to Michelle, a comprehensive unit about moral courage, dignity in the face of discrimination, and the power of forgiveness. "Would you be willing to do a video call with my class sometime?" she asked hopefully. "They need to hear this story from someone who lived it." As the plane descended through the clouds, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The young girl who had drawn the superhero picture earlier was pressing her face against the window, amazed by the view. Her mother caught Michelle's eye and mouthed, "Thank you, once again, not just for entertaining her daughter throughout the flight, but for providing a real-life example of what it means to be a hero." Robert was typing furiously on his laptop, drafting what he explained was a new company-wide initiative on inclusive leadership. "Today's experience has shown me that we need to go beyond traditional diversity training," he explained. "We need to share real stories, create real connections, and address the root causes of prejudice." The software engineer who had shared his own experiences of discrimination earlier approached Michelle's row one last time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in my work, we talk about viral content all the time. But today I've seen something truly worth going viral, a story about human dignity and the possibility of change." As the aircraft made its final approach, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're about to land in San Francisco. The weather is clear, temperature is 72 degrees, and I've just been informed that we have some special guests waiting at our gate, representatives from local veterans groups who've heard about today's events and want to express their support." The news spread through the cabin, causing another wave of emotion. The travel blogger, whose initial posts had helped spread the story, was now receiving messages from major news organizations interested in covering the incident. "They're not interested in the conflict," she explained to those around her, "they want to focus on the transformation and healing that happened afterward." Lisa Chen, who had been a constant supportive presence throughout the flight, began preparing the cabin for landing. She paused by Michelle's row one last time. "My brother in the Marines," she said softly, "he faces similar situations sometimes. Your example today will help him and so many others know how to respond with dignity." The young girl's superhero drawing had made its way around the cabin, with various passengers adding their own messages of support and appreciation around the margins. When it finally returned to Michelle, it had become a touching collaborative artwork, a testament to how a single act of dignity could inspire an entire community. As the plane's wheels touched down on the runway, there was a sense among the passengers that they had been part of something extraordinary. What had begun as an ugly display of prejudice had transformed into a powerful lesson about human potential for growth and change. The businessman who had started the day as an antagonist was ending it as an advocate for change. The quiet soldier who had faced discrimination had become an inspiration. And a plane full of strangers had become a community, bound together by their shared experience of witnessing and participating in a profound moment of human connection. The arrival gate at San Francisco International Airport buzzed with unusual energy as Flight 2317 taxied to its final position. Through the windows, passengers could see a small gathering of people holding welcome signs and American flags. The story that had unfolded during their 6-hour flight had reached the ground long before they had. As the seatbelt signs switched off, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual rush to retrieve luggage and exit, passengers remained seated. A spontaneous gesture of respect had taken hold, everyone wordlessly agreed to let Michelle deplane first. The quiet solidarity of the moment spoke volumes about how the journey had transformed them all. The young girl who had drawn the superhero picture stood in the aisle with her mother, clutching a new drawing she had completed during landing. This one showed a diverse group of people holding hands around an airplane, with the words, "We are all heroes," written in colorful letters. "I made this for everyone," she announced proudly, holding it up for all to see. As Michelle made her way toward the front of the aircraft, passengers reached out to shake her hand or simply nod in acknowledgement. The elderly couple in first class, who had heard the story through the travel blogger's posts, stood and saluted as she passed. The gentleman, a Vietnam veteran himself, had tears in his eyes. Robert, the businessman whose transformation had been central to the day's events, walked a few steps behind Michelle. He had called his company's board members during their brief layover, proposing an immediate review of their diversity and inclusion policies. "Today's experience will reshape our entire approach," he explained to those around him. "We need to focus on real stories, real people, and real change." At the gate, the welcoming committee included representatives from various veterans organizations, local military support groups, and even a few off-duty service members who had heard about the incident through social media. Among them stood a familiar face, Michelle's brother, who had driven up from his base in Mountain View after seeing the viral posts. The reunion between siblings was touching, made more poignant by the circumstances that had brought it about. "Only you," her brother said with pride, "could turn a flight delay into a national conversation about dignity and respect." His presence added another layer of meaning to the day's events, a reminder that military service often runs in families, creating generations of individuals committed to protecting American values. Mrs. Chen, who had witnessed the entire journey from her window seat, was met by her son and his family, including the newborn great-grandchild she had traveled to meet. As she introduced them to Michelle, she said something profound: "This little one will grow up hearing about today as a family story, about how standing up for dignity with grace can change hearts and minds." The travel blogger, whose initial posts had helped spread the story, was now surrounded by local media who had gathered at the gate. She directed them to Michelle, but also made sure they understood the broader narrative. "This isn't just about one incident," she explained. "It's about how a group of strangers became a community through witnessing and participating in a moment of transformation." Lisa Chen, the flight attendant who had been such a steady presence throughout the flight, made an announcement over the gate's PA system. "The airline would like to acknowledge something extraordinary that happened on our flight today," she began, her voice carrying emotion. "We witnessed how one person's dignity and grace turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for understanding and growth." The young college student who had documented the journey through his sketches had already begun sharing his artwork on social media. His drawings captured key moments from the flight: the initial confrontation, the quiet dignity of Michelle's response, the transformation of Robert, and the way the entire cabin had come together. His visual storytelling added yet another dimension to how the story was being shared and understood. The middle school teacher had already received approval from her principal to develop a full curriculum unit based on the day's events. "We're going to call it Dignity in Action," she explained excitedly to those around her. "It's going to help students understand how to handle difficult situations with grace and how to be upstanders rather than bystanders." As passengers from Flight 2317 dispersed into the terminal, many lingered longer than usual, exchanging contact information and making plans to stay connected. The software engineer who had shared his own experiences of discrimination was already working on creating an online platform where people could share similar stories of transformation and healing. Local community leaders who had come to the gate began discussing plans for a town hall meeting about inclusion and understanding. Robert, still processing his own transformation, immediately offered to sponsor the event through his company. "We need to create more spaces for these conversations," he insisted. "Today showed me how powerful they can be." Michelle's story had already begun appearing on military support websites and social media channels, with thousands of service members sharing their own experiences and expressing gratitude for her example. A hashtag had emerged, #DignityInUniform, celebrating those who maintain their composure and professionalism in the face of prejudice. The young girl's mother, a social media content creator, had captured key moments of the flight on her phone, with permission from those involved. Her short video clips, showing the transformation from conflict to understanding, were already gaining traction online. These aren't just viral moments, she explained to interested observers. They're teaching moments that can help change perspectives. In the days following the remarkable flight from Atlanta to San Francisco, the story continued to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. The airport terminal's brief gathering had been just the beginning of a much larger movement, one that would touch lives far beyond those who had been on Flight 2317. A week after landing, Michelle found herself sitting in a comfortable studio chair, preparing for an interview with a national morning show. The producers had been drawn to the story not for its initial conflict, but for the extraordinary transformation that had taken place at 35,000 feet. "We want to focus on the healing," they explained, "on how dignity can bridge divides." The young girl's drawings, both the superhero sketch and the "We Are All Heroes" artwork, had been professionally framed and now hung in the airline's corporate headquarters. They served as a daily reminder to staff about the power of handling difficult situations with grace. The airline had also launched a new training program for their crew members, using the events of Flight 2317 as a case study in conflict resolution and promoting inclusion. Roberts' consulting firm had undergone its own transformation. He had assembled a new division focused specifically on authentic diversity and inclusion training, moving beyond theoretical workshops to focus on real-world experiences and personal transformation. Michelle had accepted his invitation to speak at corporate events, but with a condition, that a portion of all proceeds would go to veteran support organizations. Mrs. Chen's great-grandchild, barely a week old when the flight landed, had already become part of a story that would be passed down through generations. During a family gathering, she shared how the experience had reminded her of her late husband's wisdom about fighting darkness with light. Her son, inspired by the story, had started a community initiative bringing together veterans and local business leaders to mentor young people from diverse backgrounds. The middle school teacher's curriculum, Dignity in Action, had been picked up by her entire school district. Students were particularly moved by the real-time sketches from the art student who had documented the flight. His visual narrative helped young people understand complex concepts about prejudice, forgiveness, and transformation in accessible ways. Lisa Chen, the flight attendant whose steady presence had helped guide the situation, found herself becoming an informal mentor to other crew members dealing with similar situations. "The key," she would tell them, "is to recognize that beneath every conflict lies an opportunity for understanding." Her brother, the Marine, had shared the story with his unit, where it sparked important conversations about handling discrimination with professionalism and grace. The travel blogger's initial posts had evolved into a full-length feature article for a major magazine, exploring how one moment of confrontation had sparked a movement of understanding. She interviewed passengers who had been on the flight, each sharing how the experience had changed their perspective and influenced their actions in the weeks that followed. The software engineer's online platform for sharing stories of transformation had grown rapidly, attracting thousands of users who shared their own experiences of choosing dignity over anger, understanding over confrontation. He named the platform Altitude, inspired by how the height of Flight 2317 had provided a new perspective on human connection. The young girl who had drawn the pictures had become something of a celebrity at her elementary school. Her art teacher had used her drawings as a springboard for a project about using art to promote understanding and kindness. The entire third grade had created a collaborative mural inspired by her "We Are All Heroes" message. Local veterans groups reported a surge in community support, with many people inspired by Michelle's story reaching out to ask how they could help service members facing discrimination. The hashtag Dignity in Uniform had evolved into a movement, with service members sharing their own stories of maintaining composure and professionalism in challenging situations. Robert's personal transformation had perhaps the most unexpected ripple effect. His public acknowledgement of his prejudice and subsequent change had inspired other business leaders to examine their own biases and take concrete steps toward creating more inclusive workplaces. He had become an unlikely but powerful advocate for change, using his platform to encourage other executives to move beyond superficial diversity initiatives to address deeper issues of bias and discrimination. The art student sketches had been exhibited at his college gallery, drawing visitors from across the city. The exhibition, titled Transformation at Altitude, captured key moments from the flight through his artistic lens. Visitors were particularly moved by his depiction of the moment Robert returned to apologize, the subtle shift in body language and facial expressions telling a powerful story of human growth. Michelle's military unit had incorporated the incident into their training materials, using it as an example of how to maintain professionalism and dignity under pressure. Her commanding officer noted that the story resonated particularly well with young recruits, helping them understand that true strength often manifests in moments of restraint rather than confrontation. The airline's corporate headquarters had created a permanent display about Flight 2317, featuring photographs, testimonials, and artifacts from the journey. The centerpiece was a large monitor showing a rotating collection of messages from people whose lives had been touched by the story, each sharing how it had inspired them to handle difficult situations with greater understanding and grace. Mrs. Chen's local community center had started a monthly dialogue series called Bridges, bringing together people from different backgrounds to share stories and build understanding. The first session had opened with her recounting the events of Flight 2317, setting a tone of honesty and openness that encouraged others to share their own experiences of prejudice, growth, and reconciliation. 1 month after Flight 2317, the impact of that remarkable journey continued to resonate across the country in profound and unexpected ways. What had begun as a confrontation in an airplane cabin had sparked a national conversation about dignity, respect, and the power of choosing understanding over anger. The story had caught the attention of a renowned documentary filmmaker who saw something unique in how the events had unfolded. Most stories about discrimination focus on the conflict, she explained during a preliminary interview with Michelle. But this is about transformation, about how one person's dignity can change not just a single heart, but an entire community. The middle school teacher's Dignity in Action curriculum had spread beyond her district, with schools across the country requesting access to the materials. Students were particularly moved by video calls with Michelle, where she shared her experiences and answered their questions about handling difficult situations with grace. One 8th grader's response captured the program's impact. Before, I thought being strong meant fighting back. Now I understand that sometimes the strongest thing is to stay calm and help others learn. Robert's transformation had led to unexpected developments in the corporate world. His consulting firm had organized a landmark conference titled Beyond Bias, Real Stories, Real Change, bringing together business leaders, diversity experts, and people with lived experiences of discrimination. Michelle was a keynote speaker, but the real power came from the honest discussions that followed, where executives shared their own journeys of recognizing and addressing their biases. The art student sketches had evolved into a traveling exhibition, moving from his college gallery to museums and community centers across the country. Each venue added a local component, inviting community members to share their own stories of transformation through art. The exhibition became a space for dialogue, with visitors often staying for hours to discuss their experiences with others. Mrs. Chen's great-grandchild had become the inspiration for a children's book series about understanding and acceptance. The first book, titled The Flight That Changed Everything, told a simplified version of Flight 2317's story through the eyes of the young girl who had drawn the superhero pictures. The illustrations, created in collaboration with the art student, captured both the tension and beauty of that day. Lisa Chen, the flight attendant, had been promoted to a position training other crew members in conflict resolution. Her approach, based on what she had witnessed on Flight 2317, emphasized the importance of creating space for transformation rather than just managing conflicts. Sometimes, she would tell her trainees, the most powerful thing we can do is step back and let people find their way to understanding. The software engineers' Altitude platform had grown into a movement, with users from around the world sharing stories of choosing dignity over conflict. One particularly moving post came from a teacher in rural Minnesota, who described how sharing Michelle's story had helped her students handle a difficult situation with a transfer student from a different background. The young girl who had drawn the pictures had started an after-school art club focused on creating works that promoted understanding and kindness. With support from her art teacher and parents, the club had grown to include students from several nearby schools, each bringing their own experiences and perspectives to their artistic expressions. Veterans organizations reported a significant shift in how they approached incidents of discrimination. Rather than focusing solely on supporting veterans who experienced prejudice, they began developing programs to bridge divides between military and civilian communities. Michelle's story became a cornerstone of these efforts, demonstrating how military values of discipline and dignity could transform civilian interactions. The Travel Bloggers magazine article had sparked a series of follow-up pieces exploring similar stories of transformation. Readers began submitting their own accounts of moments when choosing dignity over anger had led to unexpected positive outcomes. The magazine created a regular feature called Moments of Grace, celebrating these everyday heroes who chose understanding over conflict. Robert's personal journey had inspired a research study at a major university, examining how authentic accounts of transformation could impact corporate diversity training. Early results suggested that real stories like Flight 2317 were significantly more effective in changing attitudes and behaviors than traditional training methods. The airline had experienced its own transformation, with crew members reporting a new sense of purpose in their roles. They weren't just managing customer service situations anymore, they were creating spaces where understanding could flourish. The airline's training program now included a module called The Dignity Difference, using Flight 2317 as a case study in how to handle difficult situations with grace. Michelle's military unit had developed a new approach to community relations, organizing regular dialogue sessions between service members and local communities. These sessions often began with someone sharing the story of Flight 2317, using it as a springboard for honest discussions about prejudice, service, and understanding. Mrs. Chen's community dialogue series had expanded to include virtual participants from around the world. Each session now featured stories of transformation from different cultures and contexts, building a global narrative about the power of dignity to bridge divides. Her great-grandchild, though still too young to understand, was growing up surrounded by these stories of hope and change. The hashtag Dignity in Uniform had evolved into a broader movement, with people from all walks of life sharing moments when they chose understanding over confrontation. A police officer in Texas shared how remembering Michelle's story had helped him handle a tense situation with grace. A nurse in Chicago described using the same principles to bridge cultural divides in her hospital unit. 6 months after Flight 2317, on a crisp autumn morning, a special gathering took place at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. The event, titled Dignity Day, brought together many of the passengers from that transformative flight, along with thousands of others who had been touched by their story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass as people assembled, many wearing pins featuring the now iconic "We Are All Heroes" artwork. Michelle stood at the podium, her military uniform as pristine as it had been that day on the flight, addressing a crowd that included military personnel, civilians, corporate leaders, and families. Her own family sat in the front row, including her parents who had watched with pride as their daughter's quiet strength had inspired a movement. 6 months ago, I boarded a flight as just another soldier heading home, she began, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering. I never imagined that a moment of confrontation would become a catalyst for such profound change. But that's the thing about dignity, it has a power all its own, a power that can transform not just moments, but lives. In the crowd, Robert sat with his family and several executives from his company. The consulting firm had just launched its 100th Real Change workshop, using the principles learned from Flight 2317 to help organizations build genuinely inclusive cultures. But more importantly, his own family had been transformed. His teenage children had started diversity clubs at their schools, inspired by their father's journey from prejudice to understanding. Mrs. Chen was there too, holding her now 6-month-old great-grandchild. The baby wore a tiny T-shirt with the "We Are All Heroes" design, a symbol of hope for a new generation. The community dialogue series she had started had grown into a national network of conversation circles, each dedicated to building bridges of understanding across different communities. The young girl who had drawn the original superhero picture was now a budding activist in her own right. Her school art club had expanded to 30 chapters across the country, each using art to promote understanding and acceptance. She had just finished presenting her latest project, a collaborative mural created by children from different backgrounds, each adding their own vision of what dignity looks like. Lisa Chen, the flight attendant, had risen to become the airline's director of cultural training. Under her leadership, the airline had transformed its approach to handling difficult situations, emphasizing dignity and understanding over mere conflict resolution. The training program she developed had been adopted by airlines around the world, creating a ripple effect throughout the industry. The art student sketches had been published as a book, Moments of Change, the Flight 2317 story, with proceeds supporting scholarships for students committed to using art for social change. His simple, powerful drawings had captured not just the events of that day, but the human capacity for transformation that they represented. The middle school teacher's curriculum had reached over 1 million students, with educators reporting significant improvements in how their students handled difficult situations. One school principal shared how a potential conflict between student groups had been transformed when a student asked, "What would the soldier from Flight 2317 do?" The software engineer's Altitude platform had evolved into a global movement, with stories of dignity and transformation being shared from every corner of the world. Companies, schools, and organizations used these real-life examples to teach the power of choosing understanding over conflict. The travel blogger's articles had sparked a new genre of journalism focused on transformation and healing rather than conflict and division. Her latest piece, 6 months later, The Lasting Impact of Flight 2317, had gone viral, reaching millions of readers worldwide. As Michelle continued her speech, she acknowledged the unexpected ways the story had grown beyond that single flight. What happened that day wasn't just about one person choosing dignity over anger, she explained. It was about an entire community coming together to witness and participate in transformation. Each person on that flight played a role in turning a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for understanding. The documentary filmmaker, who had spent months following the ripple effects of Flight 2317, premiered a short film at the event. Titled The Dignity Effect, it captured not just the events of the flight, but the countless ways in which that single moment of grace had sparked change across the country. Veterans organizations reported that the #DignityInUniform movement had led to new partnerships between military and civilian communities. Training programs now included modules on handling discrimination with professionalism and grace, using Michelle's example as a model for future generations of service members. Near the end of the ceremony, a surprise announcement was made. The Smithsonian Institution would create a permanent exhibition about Flight 2317, preserving the story for future generations. The display would include the original artwork, the art student sketches, and interactive elements allowing visitors to explore their own capacity for transformation. As the event drew to a close, Michelle invited everyone present to stand and join hands, forming a huge circle on the National Mall. The simple gesture echoed the young girl's drawing of people holding hands around an airplane, but now it was reality rather than artwork. The story of Flight 2317 isn't over, Michelle concluded, looking out at the thousands of joined hands. It continues every time someone chooses dignity over anger, understanding over prejudice, and love over hate. We are all part of this story now, and together, we can keep its spirit alive for generations to come. As the autumn sun began to set over the National Mall, casting a golden glow across the gathered crowd, there was a sense that something profound had been achieved. What had begun as a moment of conflict on a routine flight had transformed into a movement that touched lives across the nation, proving that sometimes the greatest changes start with a single act of dignity.